lights. Do you want them all? Well, first of all, let me say that sometimes I drift away from the microphone, go like this, and I'll come back and I'll get right so that you can hear me again. The other thing I'm going to say is that I'm going to show you many pictures tonight of early Rhode Islanders. These are all people's imagination. There are no pictures of these early Rhode Islanders that can be proved. And most of the ones I'm going to show you were done in the Victorian period, but they illustrate something. Now, John Clarke is most famous for things that he did away from Aquidneck Island, for his persecution for his Baptist beliefs in Massachusetts, and for his time in London when he got the Charter of Rhode Island in 1663. But Newport was his American home, and I grew up here. We were at the Newport Historical Society, so I thought it would be really interesting to talk about his relationship with this island. We'll take a look at his path to coming here, his part in the negotiations for the island, his part in the purchase of the island, the settlement of it, both Portsmouth and Newport, and where he lived, what he did here, and of course we have to look at the foundation of the First Baptist Church of Newport. It was the only formally organized church in Newport for many years. Now, it's always a hard thing to learn about John Clarke because he wasn't like Roger Williams who wrote letters. Anytime an idea went through Roger Williams' head, he wrote it down and he sent it to somebody or he published it. This was not true with John Clarke. But when he published Ill News from New England in 1652, he did include a few paragraphs about his coming to America and about the purchase of and settlement of Aquidneck Island. Is this little section complete? Is it accurate? Is it even internally consistent? I'm afraid that the answer is often no, but it's the best we have. So let's go back a little bit before John Clarke to the people who lived in what is now Rhode Island, say 1630. There was no permanent English settlement here. We had Blackstone in the northern part of the colony, but he was a lonely man living by himself. He was not part of the settlement of the town. Now, being Rhode Islanders, we love the story of Roger Williams fleeing through the snow from Salem, where he had been banished and was about to be deported. We love the fact that he was sheltered by the Wampanoags and learned their language. We love the fact that he bought what is Providence County from Canonicus and my Antinomian. And I don't know, maybe those of you up front can enjoy the marks that the sachems made on the deed of Providence. This is the statue of Canonicus at North Burial Ground in Providence. So what was happening during Roger Williams' time in Rhode Island? Well, from the perspective of civil and religious leaders in Boston, all hell was breaking loose. Now, there was a huge squabble in the First Church of Boston. This relief of the signing of the covenant of the First Church is not particularly historically accurate, but the sense of hardened purpose has a lot of truth to it. The problem really came from one pretty small family. John Wheelwright, newly arrived minister from England, was asked to give the Fast Day sermon at the First Church of Boston. And he gave a real corker. It was full of passionate ideas that the Gospels brought fire to the land, and you should settle your religious differences with fire and the sword. Oh, he was arrested, not so much for his theology, but because of the danger that he posed to a civil society. He did have other theological ideas that were dangerous, but it was the idea of an uprising that people feared. In fact, they feared it so much that when people from Boston and the surrounding towns petitioned for his mercy when he was going to be tried, the people who signed that petition were disenfranchised. That meant they couldn't vote. And then they were disarmed. In the middle of the Pequot War, they had to take their guns, their swords, their bows and arrows, and all their ammunitions to a central place in Boston and give them up, because the town was so afraid that he was going to cause an uprising. The people had feared, or the government feared, wheelwright, but the real danger was wheelwright's sister-in-law, a gentle midwife named Anne Hutchinson. She had the temerity to teach groups of women about the Bible in her own home. Imagine, a woman. She stood up to the ministers who examined her at her church trial. On the lower side, there's the lovely John Cotton, who actually did try to defend her as much as he could, but it was a tepid defense. And people like Endicott, who was, he was a real bad guy, I think. At this point, John Clarke comes into the story in Ill News. He said, "In the year 37, I left my native land, and in the 9th month of the same, I through mercy arrived at Boston. I was no sooner on shore, but there appeared to me differences among them touching the covenants." And I think that he gives us here the best explanation of the Antinomian Crisis. Some pressed hard for the covenant of works and for sanctification, and that was the Puritan core of the First Church of Boston. Others pressed as hard for the covenant of grace and for the evidence of the Spirit. Anne Hutchinson believed that grace was freely given and something you experienced in your heart, not something you worked for, but it was freely given. Now, wheelwright was banished, and I apologize because this is so faint, I think you'll have trouble seeing it, but he went north. This is in November of 1637, and really founded the town of Exeter, New Hampshire, which is, here's Exchester. Only a few of the people from Massachusetts went with him. And one of the anomalies that really bothers me about Ill News is that John Clarke said he went north because of the suffocating heat of the previous summer, which was a little odd if he had arrived in November. Anne Hutchinson was held in house arrest until the spring when her second trial would happen. She was banished and then excommunicated just to make things fine. She actually planned to go north to be with wheelwright. But while she had been under house arrest, matters had taken a different turn. The Portsmouth, what we call the Portsmouth Compact, was signed on March 7th in Boston. It was signed at the house of the richest man in Boston, who was William Coddington. They got together at his house, which was probably his brick house, the only brick house in Boston, and they formed a body politic. In other words, they were going to be a civil community, but they were going to live by the laws of Jesus Christ. This is not what you call a practical town plan, but it was an example of their idealism. And the people who signed this were people, some from Boston, but some from surrounding communities, all of whom had signed the petition and had been disenfranchised and disarmed, some of whom were banished. Now, in a 17th century document, you can often tell the importance of the people signing by the order in which they signed, at least at the top. You notice that the first signature is William Coddington, Mr. Richest Man in Boston. The third man is William Hutchinson Sr. He was the husband of Anne Hutchinson. He was a merchant. Then we have John Cogshell and William Aspinwall, both of whom had held government positions in the Massachusetts Bay colony. What I cannot understand is how the second person on there is John Clarke. If John Clarke had truly arrived 4 months before and spent time in New Hampshire, what on earth was he? How could this doctor, who didn't know New England, have been important in advising them where to go and what to do? He says that he was asked to help them find a place. Now, this was called the Portsmouth Compact, but there was no Portsmouth. We call it the Portsmouth Compact. They didn't call it anything. Up at the top, it just has the date. John Clarke says, I was requested with some others to seek out a place, which accordingly I was ready to do. Some others appear to have been Coddington and Hutchinson. John Clarke said they were on the wing and resolved through the help of Christ to get clear of all and be of ourselves. But where? They were in Boston. Clarke says that they had their eye on 2 places, Long Island and Delaware. Now, I personally do not believe that Rhode Island would ever have existed if that group of people had got on the ship and gone to Delaware. I think we would have been immediately sucked into Massachusetts. The story of their going is so interesting, and only Clarke tells us this. He said they got on the ship in Boston. Now, in those days, there was no Cape Cod Canal. You had to go around Cape Cod. It was a horrible winter. The harbor in Boston had frozen. It was snowed until April. And weather must have been really, really bad because they got off the ship and said they were going to walk and meet the ship on the other side. Well, that sounds like a heck of a lot of fun. But where did they go? They ended up right on the doorstep of Roger Williams, asking his advice about where they should try to settle. And Clarke says, he readily presented 2 places before us in the same Narragansett Bay, the one upon the main called Soams, the other one called Aquidneck, then now Rhode Island. We inquired whether they would fall in any other pattern, for our resolution was to go out of them all. In other words, they didn't want to be within another colony. Roger Williams was a little sensitive on that subject himself because he had been forced to leave Seacom because that was in Plymouth patent. So Roger Williams said, we have to go ask. And they put on their boots and they walked to Plymouth. Now, in Plymouth, they had a meeting with William Bradford and other elders. I love this meeting. This is absolutely fascinating because it's the only time when you get 2 completely opposite versions of what happened at the same meeting. John Clarke has an absolutely lovey-dovey description. And he said, the magistrates there very lovingly gave us a meeting. Now, it is true that Bradford and so on ruled out Solmes, calling it the garden of their patent and the flower of their garden. But Roger Williams said, well, what about Aquidneck Island? And Clarke says, they all with a cheerful countenance made us this answer. It was in their thoughts to have advised us thereto, and if the provident hand of God should pitch us thereon, they should be assistant unto us upon the main meaning mainland. Well, that's not what William Bradford said. He wrote a letter to John Winthrop. Now, it is true that he was trying to placate Winthrop, who was absolutely furious over this. And he said, there was not long since here with us Mr. Coddington and some other of your people who brought Mr. Williams with him and pressed us hard for a place at or near Solmes, at which we denied them. And he went on to say that they had agreed to Aquidneck Island if, number one, if they could negotiate it with the Narragansetts, but also not because they wanted them there, but because they thought that as a defensive idea, it was important to have an English settlement at the mouth of Narragansett Bay. Funny thing is about that Winthrop later on used that self-same argument, so I guess he bought it. Now, this was a start, but it wasn't exactly getting Aquidneck Island. They had to go and talk to the people who owned it, who were the Narragansetts. And the local sachem said, no, you have to talk to my Antinomian, who was the big boss. Roger Williams wrote about this. Clarke is extremely vague. He just said that God moved the hearts of the native people so that they could live there. But Roger Williams wrote about it in quite significant detail many decades later. He said, it was not price nor money that could have purchased Rhode Island. And by Rhode Island, he meant Aquidneck Island. That was the name of Aquidneck Island. Rhode Island was obtained by love. That love and favor which that honorable gentleman, Sir Henry Vane, and myself had with that great sachem, my Antinomian, about that league which I procured between the Massachusetts English and the Narragansetts in the Pequot War. And then he had to explain the 40 fathoms of wampum. He said, it is true I advised a gratuity to be presented to the sachem and the natives. And because Mr. Coddington and the rest of my loving countrymen were to inhabit the place, I drew up a writing in Mr. Coddington's name and the names of my loving, such of my loving countrymen as came up with him. That original deed appears to have been lost. There's a copy at Rhode Island State Archives, but it doesn't have the names of the other people, it just shows Coddington. Now, Roger Williams was a person who was extremely good at reading motivation. And he wrote a letter closer to the time when this happened to Winthrop. And he knew full well that love was not the only explanation of why the Narragansetts were willing to sell this. He said that if they had ever conceived the outcast status of himself and Coddington, whom they knew many years as sachems in Boston, they would never have sold those islands. In other words, my Antinomian anticipated continuing returns on his gifts. This is, of course, not a picture of the Antinomian migration, but a picture of people in Salem, but it's people of the right period walking through the snow. Very, very quickly, as many as 80 families started to move. They were really being pressured by Massachusetts. And in some cases, the men in a family would come and they would build housing, and then the women would come later. But in some cases, the families came all together. Coddington wrote to Winthrop about his sudden removal upon 14 days' time to a place without housing. What myself and my wife and family did endure in that removal, I wish neither you nor yours may ever be put unto. None of the settlers actually described how they got here. Surely they most of them didn't have enough money to go by boat, and they simply walked. We know what it was like to walk from Boston to Aquidneck Island, well, when you're not taking the boat across, where the ferry goes, because a man named William Hibbins and 2 other messengers were sent by the First Church to Boston to try to coax these settlers back. He was sent the following February. These people left. That deed for Aquidneck Island was signed March 24th. You remember that the compact had only been signed in Boston on the 7th. They had walked to Providence, they had walked to Plymouth, and then they must have walked to Aquidneck Island. These people were actually real estate guys. Little Hibbins was a gentleman, and as far as I can tell, he was no outdoorsman. He said that the 3 of them went first to Mount Wollaston, where they were outfitted for their trip by Thomas Savage, who was incidentally Anne Hutchinson's son-in-law. And the first day he really worried when they set out because, as he said, he had never been used to sleep without a bed. Finally, they met a man in the woods who said, well, they could sleep at his house. Each day afterward, he described some disaster. The canoe got hitched up on a tree, and he didn't know what was wrong. He didn't realize he could have died. The next day, there was a big snowstorm. One of the messengers disappeared. They couldn't start a fire. The next day, there was another canoe accident. Then the day after that, they finally got to what is now Portsmouth, to their great rejoicing. The rejoicing, I can safely say, was not shared by the settlers. Now, we learn quite a bit more from what Hibbins had to say about that settlement than we do from what any of the actual settlers said. The original settlement had been at what we call Founder's Brook. This is an early 20th century picture. It's not the way it looks now, but it's where there's a plaque and a monument to this settlement. There was water there. There was good water supply there, but that dried up after a while, and people moved away from any central part of Portsmouth. Portsmouth has always been a very decentralized place. Now, the settlers who came, I don't know, from the angle I am, I can't figure out whether you can see this at all, but if you can't, look online. The Portsmouth Historical Society has wonderful maps that were drawn up in the 30s by Edward West. And the people who settled Portsmouth had not come directly from England, with the exception of John Clarke, as far as I can see. And they were experienced at setting up the town, and they knew that you gave each settler got a house lot, a marsh lot, a place to pasture animals, a calf lot, and over here, whether you can see it or not, it shows that John Clarke and William Coddington both owned small pieces of land near the town pond. Where exactly that was, I don't know, but I personally take great pleasure in imagining his house on the golf course. Now, they set up a slightly weird government with the top official, and you can just guess who that was. William Coddington, as the judge. And a judge in the sense of, like Solomon was a judge, and he had advisors, but he really was supposed to interpret the Bible to find the answer to any legal problem. They planned for a meeting house, but not one was built until 1700, and that was a Quaker meeting house. John Clarke and his siblings, whom he had conveniently forgot to mention in ill news, Thomas Clarke and Joseph and his sister Mary, all are faint presences in the early records of Portsmouth. Now, in ill news, Clarke presented a sort of happily ever after version of the history of Aquidneck Island. That the Massachusetts Puritans had predicted that the cantankerous outcasts could not form a cohesive community, and they were right. Within a year, this settlement split. Why did it split? Well, you had the Hutchinsons on one side. They and their adult children owned a lot of the choicest land. And then, I'm sorry to admit, my ancestor, Samuel Gorton arrived, banished from Plymouth Colony. And, you know, he was the sort of a guy, and when he came in a room, within 5 minutes, everybody would be yelling. And so the 9 most important people in town, including Coddington and Cogshell and Easton and Henry Bull and John Clarke, upstakes and decided that they were going to have a plantation at the southern end of the island that they called Newport. People in Portsmouth went, fine. And within a year, they joined and now became what was called Rhode Island after 1640. The Newport that was started, you have to remember that the people in Portsmouth had a whole year on the island to go and explore and find a good place to start a new plantation. But I think that if we were suddenly, if this room was suddenly a Wayback Machine and we were driving, it was 1640 and we were in the same place, we would barely recognize what we saw. Because when I first saw this map, this is Judy's variant of a map that appeared in Newport history many years ago. And I was happy because I could see where Clarke lived and where Easton lived and Coddington. And then I thought, wait a minute, what's the river? I don't know any river flowing through Newport. Bert tells me that it still flows underground. It flows under Marcus Wheatland Boulevard. Where the water met the land, it was marshy, there were a lot of reeds. They were able to build a wharf where tourists stroll on Thames Street. They'd been underwater in those days. Where the houses climb up the hill was the common where the many animals the settlers grazed. But the biggest change between then and now was the cove. Now, this was a pretty wide indenture here, going to Gravelly Point, which is famous for other reasons, but that does not exist anymore. Even by the time of the Revolution, you can see that a long wharf had been built from the Newport shoreline out to Gravelly Point. There was a little drawbridge so that ships could get through. This is a 19th century photo of the cove. You can see that there are smallish boats pulled up on the shore. This is an 1891 map. And you can see that there are train trestles that had been built up across the middle of the cove. By 1907, the cove was completely filled in. And now all that's left of Gravelly Point is there's a historic marker on the street. So the settlers got very busy building houses. I think, despite what Peter Easton said, that they may have started earlier. They certainly would have built teepees, or they used wigwams as like tents. The two houses that we have any idea what they looked like from this period are William Coddington's house. Naturally, William Coddington had the biggest house in town. And after he became a Quaker, friends would meet at his house. Henry Bull lived in the left-hand side of this much larger house. His house was built in 1641, and the house was living quarters for the Bull family, but it was also the town jail. So where did John Clarke live? Well, we know vaguely from that map, but we know a lot better than that from an archaeological dig that took place in the late 1970s. And there's a book upstairs in the library called The John Clarke Property, which details what they found, all the different layers. This house was occupied for hundreds of years before it disappeared. It was at the corner of Callender Avenue and Marcus Wheaton Boulevard. I thought, when I opened this book, oh, I'm going to find all these wonderful things that John Clarke lost his pipe, or his shaving mug or something like that. And no, there was basically nothing of his period except a few wooden posts in the foundation. When I think from that map that it was on this corner in the little memorial park there where there's the monument to him. And I think it probably faced Callender Street because it's much longer footage in that direction than Marcus Wheaton Boulevard. Now, this was only his house lot, his in-town house lot. And he owned much bigger land in what is now Middletown. You can see here this rectangle that's labeled Charity Farm. That was part of his farm. He owned more of it, more land than is shown there, because I know that he sold land to James Rogers. There was over where this brook came in, because Rogers built a mill on that brook. And I think that there were other members of his church living right around there from the earliest days. Now, this is Green End Avenue from the Middletown side. You can see the pond on the left. That was taken around 1900. And here's Green End Avenue crossing the bridge. And I think all this area over here was probably his farm. Yep. And Clarke owned this farm. He kept cattle there, he kept sheep there, he kept horses there. But he was no farmer. He was trained as a doctor, and he always identified himself as a physician. This looks like a big doctor's bag, but when I took the picture of it, I can tell you it was about the size of a sheet of paper. It would fit up very conveniently in somebody's cloak. He was the only doctor for these 80 families. He had no access to an apothecary. He had, in the very earliest days, there was no surgeon on the island, and I think that he must have been a very busy man. But he will never be remembered as a doctor. right from 1638, John Winthrop called Clarke physician and preacher to those of the island. He kept trying to start a church, and then the cantankerous outcasts would say, no, we don't agree with you, and they'd leave. He had a church that had failed by 1641, and then he had another church, and probably they were meeting at his house. These were small, very small numbers of people. Ezra Stiles had a very interesting point of view that in essence, he left his church as he became more of a Baptist, and the people that he left behind, that did include Connington, eventually became Quakers. If the records of Clarke's first church, the first Baptist church of Newport, which he always called the Church of Christ at Newport, is very interesting. The original records were copied by John Comer in the very early 18th century. And when you look at this, you see that it was essentially a Clarke family church. You've got John Clarke, his wife Elizabeth, you've got Joseph Clarke, his youngest brother, Thomas Clarke, his older brother, John Peckham, his brother-in-law. And Painter was not at the church then. He didn't come until after 1650. Other people, not prominent. Where are the movers and shakers in Newport? Where are the people who were serving in the government? They are not part of this church. The most important person on this little list of first gatherers is Mark Blucher. Mark Blucher was quite higher class than the other people in, well, on Aquidneck Island, really. He was entitled to a coat of arms, and if you look down here, he's shown as the son and heir of his father, Emmanuel. Now, this family had been really distinguished. One person had been one of the founders of the Merchant Taylors' School in London, and another had been a famous scientist, another had been a very important military officer. Emmanuel Blucher's talent was for joining churches that were about to fall apart. And he was arrested at a conventicle that was held in Southwark. That's on the south bank of the Thames. And the service was being led by John Lathrop, an important figure who eventually came to Massachusetts Bay. He was examined by no other than William Laud, who eventually became Archbishop of London and a very hated, hard-nosed, tyrannical figure. And he spent time in jail. Now, what were the principles that set Baptists most apart and made them absolutely, well, unpopular is not the right word for it. Believers' baptism seems so logical to us. Why shouldn't you be baptized when you can confess your faith, when you're old enough to understand what you're doing? But in those days, it meant that babies, remember the infant mortality rate of the period, could not be baptized because they were not old enough. And when they died, the afterlife would be mighty unpleasant. It also meant that all those pious people walking around at the First Church of Boston were not properly baptized because they had been baptized in England the way Clarke was as infants. Baptism by immersion was not strictly a Baptist idea. Mark Blucher had been baptized that way in London. There was no formal clergy. Now remember, when the Puritans got to Massachusetts, by 1636, by the time Roger Williams was building his house in Providence, they had already founded Harvard University because, or they called it college, because they wanted to train clergy. And that was not the case with the Baptists. The first Baptist institution of higher learning in Rhode Island was Brown University, which was not founded until just before the Revolutionary War. Now, the real hatred with which these people were viewed in England and in America, this is a very difficult illustration to see. But look at the top. Look at the figure that's holding the banner. It's the devil. And this is talking about the different kinds of Anabaptists and their manner of rebaptizing. This rebaptizing was huge. Because if you've been properly baptized, then you would need to be baptized, and you can see where this is going. Now, Clarke's church never really caught fire in Newport. I mean, this is very strange to think of, but it got new members, but they were coming from other colonies. And they settled in what is Satchwest, the Satchwest part of Middletown. You can see, you probably won't be able to hear me, but I'll try. Here's Clarke's charity farm here, and here's the mill that was started. They had baptisms at that mill from time to time. Now, one of the most important new church members was Samuel Hubbard. He had been in Massachusetts, he'd been in Connecticut, and back in Massachusetts, but he finally found a spiritual home in Rhode Island. He lived at Whitehall, not in the Whitehall building, because that was built later, but his gravestone was found in the flower bed of Whitehall. So he lived really close to that. He owned 25 acres. He eventually left the church, and we can channel his spirit here, became a Seventh-day Baptist. So here's Obadiah Holmes and Philip Smith, John Peckham. The mighty Mayford River often appears in their documents. And what most of these guys did, not Hubbard, because he was already here, they bought jointly a really large piece of land. And Judy and I and Bert have had a lot of fun going through the deeds, and they divided it up after a few years, and then they'd sell pieces back and forth with each other. But a lot of their neighbors were Baptists and members of the church as well. Now, you might think, okay, so they settled in, everything's fine, but it wasn't fine, because Rhode Island was still shut out of the United Colonies of New England. That was a defensive organization. If there was an Indian attack, if there was a Dutch attack, it was kind of like NATO. The colonies would send troops to help the attacked people defend themselves. Rhode Island was shut out of this. They wanted no part of us. They did not want to defend us. They didn't want to have to listen to us. And this was a source of great pain to William Coddington. Now, you would think that being a rich, powerful guy with like 700 acres of land on Aquidneck Island would have been enough for him, but no. He loved the First Church of Boston, and he really wanted to reunite with those colonies, either Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay. But when he asked, no, they wanted no part of us. So, what's the next logical thing to do? Go to England and lie. So, now you've heard the story about how they negotiated for the land and how they bought the land. What Coddington said was that he discovered Aquidneck Island, and Connecticut. And he'd been living here peacefully ever since, but he wanted a grant from it, these places from England. Now, the Parliament was dealing with enormous upheaval in the colony, in the government of England at the time, and they did not have the time to do much research. And so they said, okay. And they granted him the Coddington Commission, which is in this building upstairs, and I was hoping we'd get to see it tonight, but that was not possible to arrange, so we have a very horrible picture of it. It's behind glass, so but it's exquisite penmanship, aside from the fact that it was granting something that was really bad for us. They made him governor for life of Aquidneck Island, and by the way, that was hereditary. You can imagine how the settlers who had come here and founded this place on the principles of toleration and democracy felt about that. 41 men from Portsmouth and 65 men from Newport signed a petition to John Clarke. Please go to England and get a revocation of this commission and the restoration of the patent that Roger Williams had gotten in 1643-4. Now the colony had been split in half by this commission. You had the island towns who were going to be this separate colony, and now Providence and Warwick were on their own. So Providence and Warwick chose Roger Williams to go to England to try to get this. I've had a lot of fun researching how did they go. I'd like to believe they went together, but there isn't any proof of that. When they got to London, they started the biggest PR campaign you can imagine. Not just to get this commission revoked, but also to argue against the sort of persecution that was happening in Massachusetts. Roger Williams published 5 books between 1652 and 1654 when he went home. John Clarke published Ill News from New England, which explains why he never mentions the Portsmouth Compact or anything to do with Coddington, having to do with Rhode Island. It's always, I went here, they asked me if I could do this. You didn't want to give Coddington any more screen exposure than he had. Now there's one particular book from this barrage that means so much to Judy and me. We visited the John Hay Library at Brown. This was one of the books Roger Williams published, and you can see down here at the bottom he talks about testimony to Mr. Clarke's narrative, and he's talking about Ill News there. But if you look at the inscription on the left-hand side, it says, "For his honored and beloved Mr. John Clarke, an eminent witness of Christ Jesus against the bloody doctrine of persecution," etc. And, you know, the thought that I actually got to touch the page that Roger Williams had, you know, he had written this and given it to John Clarke, it was an absolute thrill. In 1654, they succeeded, and the colony could be stitched back together. You had the revocation of the Coddington Commission, the restoration of the patent, the earlier patent. Williams went home, but Clarke stayed on as colonial agent for Rhode Island. There was a lot else going on. He was very involved in all the religious controversies and groups in that period. But he didn't have any burning need to return to Aquidneck Island because his brothers were taking care of his farm. The members of his church were doing just fine, fulfilling all the duties, because you didn't need a clergyman. And he wasn't a clergyman himself. And they were doing a good job. His wife was with him. They had no children. They had some prospects for money in England, although they were unsuccessful. And he stayed on until 1664. Or you're going to say 1664, but the charter was 1663. And it was an extraordinary document which we believe is largely written by John Clarke, and it guaranteed the Rhode Island's right to exist, which was something that Massachusetts had always denied. And religious toleration, and the words that still mean a lot to us, lively experiment. And by this, it meant living experiment, not like that way. He did not get to bring the charter back. He was poor. Rhode Island, I'm sorry to say, had not been doing a good job trying to pay his expenses. And he was living in a major city, and he was probably doing a little work here and there, but not enough to support himself, and it took him a while to get organized to come home. The charter came here with George Baxter, who was an activist for toleration in Long Island and New Jersey. And he'd been in England when the charter was signed. If you haven't been to the Charter Museum at the State House, I urge you to go. It's absolutely wonderful to see the original charter, and the explanations of it are just beautifully phrased, especially if you have visitors from out of state and they'd like to see someplace other than Newport, which of course I find hard to imagine. So Baxter brought it back, and they took it out of the box, and they examined the seal. Some of that seal is still attached to the charter when you go to Providence, and read it aloud. Now, if you know how long that charter, I mean, the charter, full-size replica at the State Archives is about this high, and it's little teeny-weeny writing. And I mean, it must have taken him an hour to read this whole charter. And people were very excited at the time. They came, when I was a kid, I loved Redwood Library, and I still do. And in those days, this flag hung over the door into the reading room, and it's supposed to be the flag that on the ship that brought the charter to Rhode Island. As a skeptical senior citizen, I have my doubts. And the reason I have my doubts is that this flag is a Union Jack. A Union Jack had been the prerogative of the royal family of Charles I, and then during the period 1640 to 1660, it was not used. After the Restoration, it was used again, but only for ships of the Royal Navy. And I find it a little hard to think that there was a ship of the Royal Navy in Port Harbor and nobody ever mentioned it. Well, we're at Redwood Library. I love this portrait. I wish it were John Clarke. But the harder I look, the more things that I find that make me really skeptical. First of all, there's much about this portrait that you can't see now, but scholars have looked at it in the past, and they've determined that the person is wearing an academic robe with some kind of red ribbon on the sleeve. Now, we don't even know for sure where Clarke went to university. I think it was probably Cambridge, but there were a lot of John Clarkes, and we can't nail down one who came from Westport. Nothing in a portrait like this is there by accident. It's there to speak to the subject's life. In the background, there's an extremely high, ornate, Baroque chair. There's curtains, rich curtains hanging down. He has his hand on a very fancy Bible, and I think this is what was called a richly covered book. During the iconoclastic period, when the Puritans first came into power, they sent people into the churches to destroy any remnants of what they called popery, any statues, any paintings of people, and any richly covered books. So it seems an unusual thing for John Clarke to pick. There's a note written in Low Dutch. There's a gavel. But the really telling thing to me is that the little book, you can't really tell, it's kind of fuzzy in this illustration, is a book of music. Now, John Clarke may have been the biggest lover of music in the world, outside church, but he absolutely said he did not want it in any church of his, that it enchanted, I can't remember the quote, but it's something like it enchanted the ear and not enchanted, but it moved the ear and not the heart. So I sincerely hope that somebody will find a document at Redwood Library that explains the complete provenance and proves that this is John Clarke, but I'm not so sure. So what was Newport like when he came back? He'd been gone since late 1651. He found that his church had gotten bigger, and then it had split in half, and the Second Baptist Church had split off. And unfortunately, before he died, it was going to split again when the Sabbatarians left, including Samuel Hubbard, and that really broke his heart. The biggest change was that Quakers had come in, and Quakers were really in power now. They were in the government. The rules of the government had been changed so that they didn't have to swear an oath to serve in the government. The Jews were here. There's never any mention of the Jews in his writing that I've been able to find. Now, John Clarke was all about toleration of religion, but it's a little easier when you're the one who's asking to be tolerated than when you have to tolerate other people. And the Quakers were quite a trial to him. He believed that they had the right to believe what they wanted, but not when they happened to be members of his own church who had Quaker ideas. The interesting thing is that when he married for the third time, his wife was the widow of a former Quaker activist, which always must have spurred interesting dinner table conversations. He was respected when he came back, honored as sort of an elder statesman, but he did not become governor. He was too old, too out of touch with the modern situation. When Roger Williams was trying to face off with the Quakers, he was being taunted as, "You old man, you old man." And Clarke, who was in his 60s at this point, was probably treated much the same way. Now, he died in Newport during King Philip's War. Many people died during that period, not necessarily of any fighting with the Indians, but there was a certain amount of famine and there was definitely widespread disease. John Clarke didn't die on a ship crossing the Atlantic in a storm, or he didn't die in jail in Boston. His brother wrote in the bottom of the John Clarke Bible, "This really lovely thing that his brother had departed this life in his own house in Newport on Rhode Island. And the day that he died, he had been lucid enough to maybe not dictate his whole long, complicated will, but at least to sign it. And in his will, he provided for his wife and his stepchildren and his nieces and nephews, his brothers. He gave land to the church, and he set up the John Clarke Trust, the first charitable educational trust in America. And that's a trust that goes on to today. And it's really something, when you look at, I was looking for illustrations, good maps. You can find it on a map of Revolutionary era Newport. You can find the Charity Farm on Civil War era maps. And in fact, I believe that most of it was sold in the 70s. Another part was sold just last fall. But the trust goes on, and when you drive, think about the farm this way. When you drive by the John Clarke Nursing Home, when you drive by the YMCA on Valley Road, you're driving past what used to be his property. Now, he asked to be buried in the southwest corner of his orchard between his two wives, so that on the last day they would all be together singing Hallelujah. Now, the Clarks haven't risen yet, as far as I know, but I have to admit, when I drive by that cemetery, my heart leaps up, and I say a silent hallelujah of thanksgiving for the life of this extraordinary man. Shakespeare said that the good men do is often interred with their bones, but the good that John Clarke did is still with us today. Toleration, the Baptist Church, a charitable trust, and the very state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Thank you. I'm supposed to be on book signing duty, so if you have questions, ask me. If you can't get me, ask Judith Harbold. Purple shirt, purple jacket here. Are there any questions?
Where's the cemetery?
It's on Marcus Wheatland Boulevard. Marcus Wheatland Boulevard. The old I have a very hard time saying Marcus Wheatland Boulevard because I want to call it West Broadway. Yes.
I believe it was the YMCA that just bought the land from the trust
yes,
within the last handful of months.
It was October of last year. They sold 8 acres, but what I don't know is they had leased it to them for a long 55 years or something like that, and the lease came up. So I don't know whether they still own any tiny part of this or whether it's entirely sold. I was hoping maybe somebody from the trust would be here who could tell us. Yes.
He was poor in England. He was a poor man in England. He was poor in England during some time in England. He was relatively poor. Would you say that?
I wouldn't say.
Well, there's
Well, coming from an academic family, I have to say there's such a thing as temporarily poor. He came from yeoman stock, and if you look at the wills of his great-grandfather and great-grandmother, it looks as if they had land that was probably leased to them in Westport, because in England it was almost impossible to own land outright. Everything belonged to a manor. I saw no sign of poverty there, but it was an area of intense persecution of Puritans.
But he ended up dying fairly wealthy.
Oh no, No. The funny thing, well, he was land poor. There was so much, you should read the book John Clarke and His Legacy, because that really describes everything that went on. He owned land, but part of it was had been mortgaged while he was in England. He had sold off parts of it, and the house lot was actually mortgaged, and Captain Dean was writing to the colony of Rhode Island and trying to get this paid off. And meanwhile, Clark's nephew was still living in the house. So he didn't leave a lot of money, but he had land in Westerly. He had a right of land in Providence that had been given to him, so that when he came back, if he brought any other persecuted families, that they could settle in Providence. His inventory is absolutely fascinating. There's so many items, like there's a whole box, there's a great gun and a carbine, and the idea of John Clarke carrying a great gun just makes me laugh. And the one little domestic detail that I loved was that he had a cheese press in his basement. So, a cheese press. Of course, there was no refrigeration, and if you had cows, you would have to preserve it, and you could do that as cheese, but not as milk. So, okay. Thank you very much.